Welcome to Heart of a Shepherd. We are still in the book of Genesis. Today, our scripture reading, Genesis 22 and 23. And the title, Where is the Lamb? Well, as we open our Bibles to our study today, we cannot determine how many years passed between the close of Genesis 21 and the events that are recorded in Genesis 22. However, it is not unreasonable to suppose that Isaac was a young man, perhaps in his late teens or early 20s, at this point in his life. One thing is for sure, he was certainly the apple of his father's eye and the joy of his old age. Now, Abraham's task was to prepare Isaac to become not only the master of all that he owned, but also the heir of God's covenant that promised, Genesis 12 verse 3, "In thee shall all families of the earth be blessed." Consider with me then Genesis 22. And here we're going to find that great crossroads of the faith of both Abraham and Isaac tested. And so consider then verses 1 through 10 of Genesis 22 that God commanded Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. Now Genesis 22 puts Abraham to the test, and God determined to prove his faith by commanding him to take Isaac, chapter 22 and verses 1 and 2, and get thee into the land of Moriah and offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains which I will tell thee of. Well, with the spirit of submission, we read that Abraham obeyed God, and early the next day he set out on a journey with his son, bearing the wood he would use for the burnt offering, Genesis 22 and verse 3. Now the trip from Beersheba to the place where God commanded him to sacrifice Isaac was a 3-day journey, according to verse 2. While arriving at Moriah, Abraham instructed his servants to stay at the foot of the mountain. At the same time, he and Isaac went up the mount to worship, promising in verse 5 they would come again. Well, placing the wood on his son, much like Jesus carried the beam of his cross, Abraham, we read, took the fire in his hand and a knife. Now both of them, the fire and the knife, both symbols of judgment. And we read that they, that is Abraham and Isaac, went both of them together in verse 6. Well, along the way, Isaac questioned his father, "Where is the lamb?" Verse 7. Abraham assured him, "My son, God will provide himself a lamb for a burnt offering." And so we read they went both of them together in verse 8. Now listen, 2,000 years later, John the Baptist would answer Isaac's question and pointing to Jesus Christ saying, "Behold the Lamb." John chapter 1 and verse 29 and verse 36. And so we already understand that Isaac then is a type or a picture that would be completed in Jesus Christ. Now, we might wonder what emotion stirred in Abraham's heart as he climbed the mountain, knowing he had been commanded to take now thy son whom thou lovest and sacrifice him. Well, arriving at the place which God had told him, Abraham built the altar and he laid the wood in place, and we read that he bound Isaac, his son. Now remember, Isaac is a late teen, even early 20s. But he bound Isaac, his son, who obviously yielded to his father's will, and then laid him on the altar upon the wood. Now faith, trust, and hope are readily identified in that event on Moriah. Now Abraham's faith went beyond himself and focused on God to provide himself a lamb for a burnt offering. Now Isaac's trust was evidenced in his submission to his father's will, who placed him on the altar. Both Abraham and Isaac hoped and believed God would be faithful to his covenant promises, and Isaac would be his father's heir. Now you can see that again repeated in Hebrews chapter 11 and verses 17 through 19. Well, the Lord intervened, Jehovah Jireh. Consider with me verses 11 through 14. Now when Abraham, we read, stretched forth his hand, and he took the knife to slay his son, suddenly the angel of the Lord called unto him out of heaven, and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here am I. And he said, the angel, Lay not thine hand upon the lad, neither do thou anything unto him, for now I know that thou fearest God, seeing thou hast not withheld thy son, thine only son, from me. When Abraham looked up, he spied a ram caught in a thicket by his horns, and he took it. And we read in verse 13 that he offered him for a burnt offering in Isaac's stead. Abraham then called the name of the place Jehovah-Jireh, meaning the Lord will provide. Now, what spiritual lessons did Abraham and Isaac take from this trial of faith? Well, Abraham learned how willing he was to trust God and walk by faith, even at the sacrifice of his son. He and Isaac realized that God was there and will provide in the moment of trial and testing. And then the Lord renewed his covenant with Abraham and said, and I quote, For because thou hast done this thing and hast not withheld thy son, thine only son, verse 17, I will multiply thy seed as the stars of the heaven. And in thy seed, that is Isaac and his lineage, shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because thou hast obeyed my voice. Now we know that promise and covenant was fulfilled in Jesus Christ. Then briefly, Genesis chapter 23, and here we have what I would call or describe as the death of a mother. We read in verse 2 that Sarah died in Kirjath Arba. Now, reminded us we are all sojourners in this world. We read Sarah was 107 and 20 years old. These were the years of the life of Sarah. And she died. And the same in Hebron in the land of Canaan. And we read in verses 1 and 2 that Abraham came to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. Now, to my knowledge, Sarah is the only woman in the Bible whose age was given at her death. She has also been a model for godly women of all ages. 1 Peter 3 verses 1 through 6 record that. Furthermore, spiritually, Sarah is the mother of all believers. Her loving submission to Abraham as the head of her household demonstrated her enduring love and commitment to him and her God. Now, to honor his wife with a proper burial, Abraham purchased land on which there was a cave. Now, we read in verses 3 through 20, that cave was in Machpelah, would be a tomb for Sarah, Abraham. Isaac and his wife Rebekah would all be buried there. And also Abraham's grandson Jacob and his wife Leah would be buried there. Well, closing thoughts. Today's scripture reading was pivotal in the history of Israel as a people and nation. God had established his covenant with Abraham, the father of two sons. Now the Lord rejected Ishmael, the son of Hagar, and he chose Isaac, the son of Sarah, and heir to God's covenant promises. And yet it was that very son, Isaac, whom God commanded to be sacrificed, and thus proving Abraham's love and faith in the Lord. And Isaac asked, Where is the lamb? And he learned he was to be sacrificed. Abraham passed the test of his faith. For we read that he believed God was able to raise him, Isaac, up even from the dead, from whence also he received him in a figure. Hebrews 11 and verse 19. What was the meaning of that last statement? It is summed up in this. When Abraham raised the knife to sacrifice Isaac, he was already offered in his heart. As God provided a substitute for Isaac, he has provided a sacrifice for you and for me, Jesus Christ. Isaac was a type or picture of Christ. And John the Baptist, as we've already mentioned, answered Isaac's questions 2,000 years later, and he said of Christ, Behold the Lamb. Well, with that, I'll close. We're continue our study tomorrow in Genesis 24 when the need arises for Isaac to have a wife. Not just any wife, but a wife who would have faith in the God of heaven and the God of Israel. I look forward to sharing that with you. God bless, and bye-bye.